When President Trump signed the tax cut bill into law, many hailed it as the most significant tax reform in 30 years. Most Americans are already paying taxes at a lower rate than they were just a few months ago. And those in the heart of the middle class, people with incomes between about $50,000 and $85,000 a year, will see cuts ranging from 11 to 36%. But tax expert Dan Pilla says while that's good news, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act isn't true tax reform because it doesn't really make the tax code simpler overall. Another problem, these tax cuts for individuals are set to expire in 2025. While that may sound like a long way off, Pilla says it adds another level of uncertainty and makes long-term tax planning more difficult. Mark Martin, CBN News.
Well, Dan Pilla is a tax expert who's helped hundreds of people resolve complicated problems with the IRS, and now he's with us. Dan, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Pat. How you doing? Happy birthday, by the way.
Thank you very much. It's coming up in 2 more days.
God bless you.
All right. You're a fan of tax cuts, but there's something wrong with this bill. Tell us what it is.
Well, very simply, they called it tax reform, Pat, and that's not what it is. It's a tax cut, no question about that. Yeah. Tax cuts across the board for everybody, very important tax cuts, very effective tax cuts, but it's not tax reform. The problem with the tax code, Pat, is we've now got 4 million words, not even including this latest reform now, the latest passage here, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. 4 million words in the Internal Revenue Code. The tax code has been changed more than 5,900 times. You didn't mishear me. That's 5,900 times since 2001. In 2008, there were 500 code sections that were changed in that year alone, not including the most recent law that's been passed.
Who does that? That's insanity.
It's pure insanity. It's absolute abject insanity. There's no question about it. And because of that, the tax code is completely unstable. And one of the biggest problems with the tax code is these expiring provisions that are in the law for a period of time and they expire after 2 years or 3 years or whatever the case may be. Before the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act was passed, there were 71 different provisions of the tax code, Pat, that were set to expire between 2018 and 2025. Every single one of the Jobs Act provisions is set to expire in 2025, with the exception of the corporate tax changes. And so the law, as good as it is as far as cutting taxes, is temporary. It's not going to last forever.
Why is it temporary? Is it the Senate? Is it the Democrats? Or what?
I think it's just simply, there's a couple things going on. First of all, I think the Republicans do some of this on purpose because they say, in order for us to continue to get reelected, we have to go back to our constituency and say, unless we get reelected, you're going to have an automatic tax increase. So I think there's some of that going on. There's no question that the Democrats didn't want any part of a tax cut. And so there's that pressure going on. And so the compromises seem to be, well, we'll throw you a bone in the form of a temporary tax cut.
What can do? I mean, what lawyer or an accountant can follow all these changes? That is mystifying.
Well, Pat, it's a full-time job. And the problem is now we've got so many people that have simply thrown in the towel when it comes to preparing their own tax returns. About 60 or 65% of every taxpayer out there uses a tax pro. Another roughly 20% use some computer software that they buy online someplace or buy in a store somewhere to do their tax returns. Very few people are going it alone. And this is a fundamental flaw in our tax system, Pat. People should have the right to know. People do have the right to know. It's an essential element of due process of law, that you have the right to know what the law requires of you, and you have the right to be able to comply with that law simply and inexpensively. We don't have that with our tax code.
Well, you also say the IRS itself is broken. Tell us about that.
Yeah, there's no question about that. You know, we've got the Internal Revenue Service is wrong between 60 to 90% of the time in the tax audit results that it comes up with.
IRS is wrong between 60 and 90%? They are wrong?
When we're talking about tax audit results, Pat, they're wrong between 60 to 90% of their time. Their own literature shows that. I talk about this in my book, How to Win Your Tax Audit. I talk at length about the problems that we have with the IRS through the audit process and their computer notices. Their computer notices are wrong about half the time, depending on what kind of notice we're talking about. So they send these things out. People get these notices. They don't understand how to deal with them. They end up paying taxes they don't owe. So people need to know what their rights are. You know, the other thing we've got going on here, Pat, is that now we've got this 4 million word tax code, and people are throwing their hands up in frustration and Every single year, the IRS spends less and less money on taxpayer assistance, even though a person who understands what he's supposed to do is more likely to comply with the law than a person who doesn't understand, and yet the IRS spends more and more money on enforcement and less money on taxpayer assistance.
What about the expansion of this standard deduction? If people itemize, are they going to lose out on some of that?
Well, it depends on your situation, of course, but again, most people are going to see a cut in their taxes, Pat.
Yeah.
This is virtually across the board. So yes, the itemized deductions have been winnowed down a little bit, but the standard deduction has been doubled for married filing jointly from $12,000 to $24,000. Mm-hmm. And so most people are going to benefit from that in the form of lower taxes, no doubt about it. The IRS has already changed the withholding tables. Your setup piece mentioned that as of February, new withholding tables are in place. So anybody that's had a W-4 form, but wage earners, 85% of Americans are wage earners, right? All of these people are now getting more money back in their paycheck every single month.
The head of the Ways and Means Committee talking about he wanted to get it so simple that you could just fill out a postcard and send it in. Is that just a dream or an illusion?
I'll go one better than that, Pat. Why don't we go to get it so simple that you don't have to file any tax return at all? Why don't we abolish the income tax entirely, abolish the IRS entirely, and go to a retail sales tax? In that case, no American citizen has to file a tax return. We don't have to worry about tax audits. We don't have to worry about tax law enforcement. No wage levies, bank levies, property seizures. You don't have to keep records. Mm-hmm. You don't have to sign a tax return and mail it to the IRS and have it subject to audit and collection. That would be the simplest way to do it.
Well, can we do that?
Well, can we do that? If I used to think that Congress was going to come to its senses, Pat, and do the right thing when it came to tax reform. I don't know about that anymore, but I'll tell you this. Yeah. I testified before the Minnesota legislature, the House Tax Committee last Thursday. I testified before the committee, and I made the presentation to the committee that we need to abolish our state income tax and the personal and corporate state income tax and go to a comprehensive state sales tax to simplify the code and to simplify compliance and to make everybody's life easier.
Did they buy that argument?
Well, put it this way, Pat. The Republicans were in favor, and the Democrats stared at me and blinked. So, what is that?
I can't believe it. All right. Hey, what's your book, the latest book? What's it called?
The latest book is called How to Get Tax Amnesty. This is the book that helps people to reduce or eliminate tax debts that they owe and cannot pay. And so if you're struggling out there with some kind of tax liability, if you're facing wage levies, bank levies, IRS penalties, interest, all these sorts of things, the book How to Get Tax Amnesty is going to help you tremendously to reduce or eliminate those debts.
Dan, you're terrific. And I wish everybody were as intelligent about the tax code as you are.
Thank you, Pat.
Hey, God bless you. Thanks for being here.
Good to see you. Happy birthday, man.
Thank you. Dan Pillows, many strategies for dealing with tax issues and problems. You can find a link to his website at cbn.com. And we appreciate Dan Pillow. Somebody that's really got his mind on this thing. Can you imagine 5,900 changes in the tax code since 2001? My goodness, how can they do